Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Consciousness Review. I'm Miriam Knight, and our guest today is JOHN MICHAEL GREER, the author of 24 books in the fields of alternative spirituality and future studies. They include the New Encyclopedia of the Occult, The Long Descent, a User's Guide to the End of the Industrial Age, and Secrets of the Lost Symbol, which has been translated into 8 languages. He is also the author of a popular weekly blog on the future called the Archdruid Report. He was born and raised in Washington State, and John Michael and his wife Sarah live in Cumberland, Maryland, in an old red brick mill town in the Appalachians. Today we're going to explore his latest book, Apocalypse Not: Everything You Know About 2012, Nostradamus, and the Rapture is Wrong. So welcome. Welcome, John Michael.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on.
It's a pleasure to have you because I really enjoyed your book and I was so looking forward to this interview. I happen to be a history nerd and this was right up my alley.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Let's start with the notion of apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
What are the characteristics that define this religious and cultural meme?
Okay, basically, an apocalypse is set apart. Well, let's start with the word. The word itself is from Greek. It comes from a root meaning to unveil, to reveal, to make visible something that wasn't previously known. And, of course, it got that name from the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, which claims to offer the real skinny on what's going to happen in the future, and has been the template that most people have used for their apocalyptic beliefs for most of the last 2,000 years in the Western world, at least. But what defines something as an apocalypse is an interesting question, because, I mean, the term's used very, very broadly. A disaster happens someplace, there's an earthquake, there's a tsunami, people say, oh, it's apocalyptic. But that's not actually what the meme is about. I mean, bad things happen all the time. The thing that makes the apocalypse meme, the thing that feeds that meme and gives the idea the emotional power that it has, is that it promises an end to the frustrations, the uncomfortable details, the ordinary humdrum reality of a regular life, and promises to replace that by something that bears a suspicious resemblance to whatever our most emotional appealing fantasies happen to be, whether that's a new age of peace and love and enlightenment on the one hand, or whether it's getting to watch the annihilation of everybody who ever made fun of you in elementary school on the other.
Okay. Where do you think this whole thing came from?
Well, one of the interesting things that came up in my research on the book, actually, is that you can actually trace the apocalypse meme back from its, of course, worldwide contemporary spread, step by step through history to a single source. As far as I've been able to tell, as far as some of the researchers who blazed the trail here have been able to tell, the entire idea was come up with by a single person, and he was Zarathustra, the founder of what's now known as the Zoroastrian religion. Zarathustra lived in what's now Iran. Nobody's quite sure when, but it may have been sometime around the 13th century BC. And he was one of the very first monotheists in history, one of the first people to think that there was one and only one deity. And he also seems to be the one who came up with the idea that sometime very soon his god was going to strap on his hobnail boots and basically beat the stuffing out of everyone who disagreed with him, Zarathustra, prove that Zarathustra's religion was right and everyone else's religion was wrong. And when that happened, everybody who agreed with Zarathustra would go on to paradise, and everyone who disagreed with Zarathustra would be plunged into rivers of boiling metal and various fun things like that. It seems like a very logical thing these days. I mean, when practically every religion, well, no, but a lot of religions in the world, at any rate, are retailing that as part of their sales pitch. But at the time, nobody else had that idea. And if you watch the spread of the idea outwards through history, you can see where Zoroastrian missionaries went, where people came into cultural contact with Persia, as it was then, or with other places that had been contacted by the Persians. The idea spread with them.
It was fascinating to me to make that connection between the Persian Empire and the Judaic thought, the Mosaic notion of one God. I mean, the Jews tend to feel that they have a patent on the idea.
No, in fact, scholars have realized a long time ago that the Jewish national religion wasn't even monotheistic until relatively recent times, historically speaking, not until after the Babylonian captivity. I think it's Raphael Patai who did a very interesting book called The Hebrew Goddess, where he talks about the polytheist folk religion of ancient Israel, and how that gradually mutated into a monotheism under the influence of the Persians. You got to remember, it was the Babylonians who after they conquered the kingdom of Judah, force-marched a lot of the surviving population off into exile in Babylon, and it was the Persians who liberated them. Mm-hmm. So the Jewish people have plenty of reason to be grateful to the Persians. And as so often happens when you have a militarily, culturally, politically dominant power rising up in a region, a lot of its ideas get picked up by a lot of the other peoples in the area, the same way that rock and roll and blue jeans have been adopted by so many people in the world a long ways from the United States. So in the same way, the idea of monotheism, the idea of a whole system of religious taboos about what you could eat and what you couldn't eat, that was also a Zoroastrian thing. All of these things found their way into Judaism. There's very little evidence that any of them existed there before the return of the exiles from the Babylonian captivity. But of course, they were very solidly in place shortly thereafter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, because the Jewish law had always been an oral tradition, and it wasn't until the time of Ezra the scribe that it was actually written down and codified.
Exactly, and that was in the first generation after the Babylonian captivity, at the period of maximum Persian influence.
Fascinating. You know, there's a lot of misunderstanding, to skip a few millennia. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the Mayan predictions about December 21st, 2012. And, you know, that's all wrapped up in this apocalyptic thinking. So could you clear that up for us?
I can certainly do that. The first thing to start with is, what did the Mayans actually say about the day for Ahau 3 Kankin 130000, the day that we call December 21st, 2012. Did they predict some kind of vast world transformation or anything like that? No, they didn't. They only mentioned the date once, in one carving on one stone stele in a minor Mayan center at Tortuguero in what's now southern Mexico. And it's just mentioned in passing. You know, such and such day, for Ahau 3 Kankim 130000, and so on. One of their gods is going to descend to, well, we don't know where, because that part of the stele was broken, and something else is going to happen. But it's nothing out of the ordinary. It's just a handful of things, and there are hundreds of other dates, even in that one site. Because the Mayans had this custom of referring things that were going on in their own times, the coronation of the king of a city-state, the birth or death of someone important, an important battle. You'll sometimes hear people insisting the Mayans were peaceful people. They weren't. They were like, you know, most rulers of city-states in that kind of setting. They were quite briskly engaged in warfare against each other for honor, for captive sacrifice to the gods, and various things like that. And so they would take these dates and they would relate them to important cycle endings and cycle beginnings in the complicated structure of Mayan time, which reaches from millions of years in the past to millions of years in the future. And so this one reference to this date was just another cycle reference. Prophecies, predictions of vast transformations of consciousness or planetary destruction or nothing. That whole business was actually invented out of whole cloth in the 1980s by Jose Arguelles, the New Age writer and New Age
Terence
writer.
McKenna.
Yeah. It was. Well, there was Terence McKenna was a slightly odder story, because Terence McKenna, of course, was one of those 60s psychedelic voyagers who thought they could discover the secrets of the universe by turning their brains inside out on very powerful psychedelic drugs. And I think he probably looked down on people like Timothy Leary who limited themselves to LSD. This is a guy who would take ayahuasca, which is one of the most powerful hallucinogens in the world, and mix it with magic mushrooms, take them both. And, after they scraped him off the ceiling, then he'd say, wow, what a trip. But now, people of a certain generation among our listeners will probably be able to fit this into their own experiences, shall we say, back a few decades. He had this one trip where he was on this particular mix where he felt time speeding up. Mm-hmm. And it was speeding up faster and faster. And so, in fact, he knew in the midst of that trip that it was going to reach infinite speed at some point in the future, and when it did so, time would stop. And that would be the end. That would be the omega point, the end of everything. Now, of course, as I say, a lot of our listeners of a certain generation will have had experiences like this, but most of us, after we came down and took some B vitamins and things like that, simply went, "Wow, that was trippy." McKenna was definitely made of stronger stuff, and so his idea was to figure out, okay, when is time going to come to an end? Long series of calculations later involving lunar calendars and the I Ching, he came up with the date in late 2012. So that's when he heard about the Mayan calendar and about there was going to be a rollover of the Mayan calendar, one of the many cycles in the calendar, in December 21st, 2012. So he went back and reworked his calculations so they came out to that date.
It's like putting the bullseye around the arrow. Yeah.
Very, very much so. But there was, what can one say? There was a certain amount of that was fairly common in the sort of 60s circles in which McKenna ran. And so basically, there was that, and that time wave zero theory was part of the rap that McKenna used to lay on audiences. And it may have been from that, it may have been from some combination of that and various other things that Jose Arguelles got the idea that the perfectly ordinary rollover of the 13 Baktun cycle in the Mayan calendar in 2012 was going to be the big date, the date where everything was going to change, where the frustrating, disappointing world we all know was going to be overwhelmed by some kind of vast transformation of consciousness, or maybe swatted by a comet, or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a pity that Arguelles died this past year, because it would be interesting to pin him down on that. Because I remember when he was talking about his thing was the 13-month year.
Oh, yeah.